thank you, all of you, for being here, and thank you to my gracious hosts. Who am I? Anyway, I'm Erik Rothenberg. I have a quite varied, some would say checkered background. I was a serial entrepreneur for about 20 years. All of these were businesses I started from scratch with little or no capital. I was in international trade for 20 years. I was I founded an internet service provider in 1993, so we watched that whole thing go up when we sold it in 2000, just before the crash. I was in the industrial hemp business. I used to trade hemp seed oil. It went into Dr. Brothers and Revlon soaps and Rachel Perry products. And my most recent endeavor was running a renewable energy company, where I built solar and I traded what kind of the flip side of carbon credits, voluntary renewable energy certificates. We pioneered that market. I sold all of that in 2007. I still had a contract for the solar business, so I built what at the time in 2008 was the second largest solar facility of its kind in the United States, the sixth largest in the world. And I learned some important lessons with that brought me to the next stage, and that is that, well, what we did, so we had a company, 3 phases, and we then set up the project, Fort Carson Army Base in Colorado, Fort Carson LLC. Then we financed and built the project, and then sold it to Morgan Stanley. And we managed to get Morgan Stanley's people to finance the project, and then we sold it to them. So they were the people that we also had to satisfy with an internal rate of return. Now, their internal rate of return was 6.25%. We would have made more money if their rate of return was 6%, and the project would have been unfinanceable at all if their rate of return was 6.5%. That taught me something about the cost of capital. And I extrapolated that, and I said, well, wait a minute. I'm going to be in this business, and it's all about the lowest cost of capital. Hold on just a second. Who's got the lowest cost of capital? Well, Goldman Sachs has really got the lowest cost of capital because Hank Paulson is running the Treasury. Well, no, in fact, it's the Federal Reserve that's got the lowest cost of capital because they just create money out of nothing. Now, hold on just a second. It's those private banks that just print money out of nothing that own the Federal Reserve that got the lowest cost of capital. Later, I would find out that 91% of the transactions on this entire planet are run through N.M. Rothschilds and Sons in London. But that's another story. And I was like, well, I really didn't want to see my business get sucked up with all this vertical integration, with the banks buying the solar companies and the utility companies buying the solar companies, because it was all about the lowest cost of capital, and I knew it was rigged. And so that was the last solar project I ever built. And I went to Peru, and I had this vision on top of Machu Picchu, and it was really the words kind of wrote across the page. Connect the value of the global economy to the value of the global ecology. I know, duh, but in 2007 that was a wild idea. I was not able to get arrested for it. Now I'm happy to say that I'm almost about to get arrested for this. So what have we got? That whole concept is pretty revolutionary because you're talking about really creating a brand new value standard based on, say, the global ecology, political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental, and everything that implies, and everything that touches. And we look at our old value standard, and what we have is a value standard that's tied to competition, domination, extraction, consumption, and waste.
And war.
Yeah, domination, right? And more domination, you get more, the same cycle repeats. And what fuels that but a scarce energy supply, oil. And ultimately, that's what our money is based on, because oil runs the economy. And so when we think about a value standard, implicitly what we're talking about is the value of oil, which is really the value of operating on these behaviors. And if we're really going to change something, we have to go beyond just creating a more efficient economy that runs the same value standard faster, better, more efficiently. Quote from Robert Kennedy in 1968 when he was talking about GMP. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but he says, gross national product, back then they called it gross national product more than gross domestic product, does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, and the joy of their play, nor the beauty of our poetry, the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debates, and the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. In short, GMP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile, and can tell us everything about America except why we are proud as Americans. So, really, if we're going to kind of use that concept and use that as a launch point, we really need to talk about measurement and value. And we need to talk about the conceptual building blocks of measurement and value. We need to talk about the transition steps and tools to how we're going to use those building blocks to actually move from now to the future in a smooth transition. And how we can succeed. And at the same time, I'm also going to talk about Ursula and how Ursula fits all into this, because Ursula is the new global economy based on highest quality of life is just the highest and best and smartest and most urgent leveraged need for the concepts that we're about to get into. But really, it has many other uses that all also help support a global economy that does this. So, with your permission, I'll get into that. See, what Kennedy was really talking about is that money value really ultimately ought to be expressed in terms of human value. And because, even if you're buying a Ferrari to impress the girls, you still get that momentary rush of adrenaline, when you get on the road or when, you get all the attention. So as fleeting as it may be, it's still expressed in human values. Or you have a table that you found, like the gentleman said, you found some old logs and you carved it by hand, and whatever it took to get it back there, you get to appreciate that story. And that's also expressed in human value. Human values ultimately reflect life. And as we all know, life is about relationships. All life is made up of relationships. I don't exist in relation just to myself. My cells exist in relation to each other, and the tissues and the organs, and me, the organism, in relation to all of you, and us in relation to all of this room. And all of the perspectives, what I experience internally and externally. What we experience internally in this communication and externally. This room is one venue. We could be experiencing this in another room. There's all these different perspectives that we have to look at how we look at the world, and how we look at measurement and value. So life and how we look at life. So life is a relationship of the parts of a whole. And a whole is usually always, at least all the way up to the biosphere and beyond, always a whole within greater wholes. And how many are familiar with the term holons and holarchy? Okay, so a holon is any kind of unit in conjunction with a bunch of other units that are parallel to it or beneath it or above it. So you can think of, let's say, the tissue of your body is a holon with the cells part of that holon and the organs part of a holarchy within that holon, and then the tissue is a holon within the holarchy of the organ, and so on and so forth. And so are we in relation to the economy, and so is everything in relation to everything. So it gets pretty complex pretty quickly in terms of being able to measure it. And this was, for the first 1,500 years since 1,500 years AD, the church controlled everything. And it was like, well, you're born in sin, you got nothing in terms of life on this planet. If you go to the church, you'll get salvation in the afterlife. And then we entered what I like to ironically term, what they termed proudly, and I like to term ironically, the Age of Enlightenment, when guys like René Descartes came along with the scientific revolution. And this is really where we started to say, okay, well, really let's start measuring the parts. And let's really think about that. Descartes, as you know, was the person who said, I think, therefore I am. Of course, I might ask, wouldn't it have just been enough to say I am? But nevertheless, it was still an improvement over you're born in sin and go through the church, to get your salvation before you die. So you got to give him some credit there. And so that kind of what they called Cartesian reductionism, now called scientific reductionism, really said, well, we're not going to really look at the relationships. We're just going to look at the parts. If we understand the parts of a whole, we can extrapolate to the whole. If we understand the operation of the cell, we should be able to extrapolate to the whole body. Well, yes and no, because if you're not really looking at all of the systems and how they interoperate, then probably not. And so if we don't have relationship and whole thinking, that leads to measurement and value that's also reductionist. And then it becomes, ultimately, if we now start attaching a money system to that really unconscious perspective, money, not value, becomes the standard and the object to be pursued, rather than life and everything that implies being the standard and the object to be pursued. And of value, the standard and object of value. So, so we live in the exabyte age. We live in an era of networked collective intelligence. And the potential exists for all of us to create a global neural network that is purposed on the highest quality of life. And an economic system supporting and being supported by that global neural network. It's also able to solve a lot of other problems. But to the degree that the economy is kind of our most important thing, because today money equals life. If you don't have any money, you don't have a place to live. You don't have any justice. You don't have a politician. There's very few places that you can live without money. And by the way, we are the only species that has to pay to live on this planet. What? Oh, hey, how you like that? Enter Ursula. So Ursula stands for Unified Rating System Universal Life Assessment. And it's a way of scoring, rating, measuring, valuing, identifying, unlocking, liberating, and creating. All value. And anything that we know, everything that we know about anything, we can take and put on the same scale. And this starts to break, or actually breaks completely, the reductionist perspective. It goes something like this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this because it's important to see how deeply ingrained this is in our kind of everyday thought. How many times have you heard the expression, not within the scope of this analysis, or outside the boundary of this analysis, or we don't measure that, or we have a list of 10 items, but they have a list of 20 items. Implicitly what we're saying is that we're drawing a circle, if you will, around what should be measured, and then everything outside that circle isn't measured. And really, it kind of begs the question of, well, first of all, how do you know that what's outside the circle isn't important enough to be measured for the thing that you're trying to get to? And the answer is always universally, we don't. Then the question is, well, how did you end up drawing that line if you don't really know in the first place? Oh, well, the 10 smartest guys in the room drew that line, which of course then begs the question, how they get called out as the 10 smartest guys in the room? Oh, well, they went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and University of Pennsylvania and so forth, and those are fine schools and they're trained people and they can draw that line. So, well, what is the standard of saying that they're experts on drawing that line? Well, you start to get into a lot of other things, a lot of other questions, and you start to pick it apart. And how do you know that this guy, this 10-year-old kid, doesn't have a solution? I mean, didn't 3 African girls invent a generator that runs on urine? Okay, we got like supposedly the smartest people working on our energy problems. Please, so you say to Descartes, if you will, well, no, you've got all these problems, and Descartes says, well, no, but if you don't draw a boundary, then you end up having to measure the whole world relative to the whole rest of the world, and that's impossible. Well, it turns out that that's not true. Not in the slightest. Not only does life look that way, and life doesn't look this way, but it is actually much more practical and now quite possible to measure relative to something else. You have a point that they're drawing the circle around. How about taking that point and draw another point, and now draw a line between those points, and now there's a relationship? How about a third point, and now there's a relationship, and now there's another relationship, and now all of those points are actually connected. And now we can start to see the beginning of some sort of geometry of relationships. Buckminster Fuller liked to call this the isotropic vector matrix in terms of like stability of what's the stability of what's the tightest stability that we can get so it doesn't implode or explode. But what we're looking for here are the relationships that support the highest quality of life. And so what are those 2 points, really? And this is pretty much the key insight of Ursula. Any subject that you want to measure, if you measure relative to an agenda, instead of just drawing a circle and saying, we're going to measure all these things about the subject, you don't get any meaning that way, because now there's 10 things, now there's 30 things. What about the 31st? When you measure it relative to the agenda, 2 things happen. Excuse me. Number 1, you instantly get meaning. Because if you measure a car relative to whether or not you're going to get to work in the morning, and a car relative to how much pollution it emits, you're going to get 2 different meanings out of that. So it really kind of depends what you're measuring it relative to. Another thing that's very interesting happens is that as soon as you have an agenda, you have context for all of the 31st, 32nd, and 3,200 things that you weren't able to measure with those first 30 things. Why? Because there's a dirty little secret to measurement, and it's called commensurability. It means that if you're going to take a bunch of things and you're going to measure them and you're going to derive a single score, all those things better fit on the same scale. And the classic example is carbon. So when we talk about global warming, we usually talk about carbon. And when we talk about carbon, we talk about things that are in carbon and carbon equivalents. Then we take trees and miles driven and stuff like that, and we convert it to carbon. But there's a lot of things that influence global warming besides carbon. And there's a lot of different things that influence carbon, such as antiquated ideas about energy that don't fit on the carbon or carbon equivalence scale. So if we're going to think about it in terms of, well, how we take all of the data, everything that we know about anything, subjective, objective, well, as soon as we're able to set a range to a given context for that class of data, we set the range relative to the given context, and now the list becomes infinite. And now the measurement becomes dynamic. Our inputs are always changing. Our data is always getting better, and we are, and the list is getting longer, or shorter as it might be. So we're able to break the mold of that circle, and by measuring a subject relative to an agenda, we're able to measure everything relative to that agenda, or that sub-agenda, or that super-agenda. Now, you could use this for a lot of different things: organizational development, collaborative research. I'm going to get into a little bit of that a little bit later. But the highest and best use of this concept is just to measure everything relative to quality of life or any subset thereof. Quality of life for all life in the shortest possible time for the longest period of time. Add a time component to it, and now you have a measurement that is actually meaningful and infinite and dynamic. And that is the opposite of what we have now. Add a value system to that, and now we've got Ursula. So, I'd like to talk about some important concepts with respect to value, because when we talk about value, what does value mean really? It's so many different things. Well, we know that it relates to life, but in what way? And all the different perspectives that we think about when it comes to value, it's kind of a complex thing. It's not complicated, but it is complex. So when we talk about quality of life, there's also quantity of life. When we say highest quality of life for all life, that's quantity, right? And when we talk about all life in the shortest possible time for the longest period of time, we're bringing in space and time elements into this. So, quality and quantity and space and time are important elements in a given context. So it's important to think about that, quality and quantity and space and time, when it comes to highest quality of life for all life in the shortest possible time for the longest period of time. Because if we can start to do that, we have a basis for higher order pattern, which is the secret to evolution. Higher order pattern is, well, you know, there's an ant and now there's a human. Okay, well, let's say there was an amphibian and now there's a human. Well, the human, you know, has a better movement. We've got thumbs, so we can pick things up, and you know, we have the ability to do more things with less effort. And higher order pattern, the more we develop and the more we evolve, as we our accumulated knowledge, for example, grows in our profession or career, we're able to do stuff that used to be a hard slog 20 years ago, we're able to do nearly without thinking. Higher order pattern. We've evolved in our thinking, and now we can do more things with less stuff, less space, and less time. And really, that kind of evolutionary design principle was at the heart of a lot of Buckminster Fuller's thinking. So, better quality and quantity with less space and time. There's this fantastic example of a 420 square foot apartment in New York City that converts into 11 rooms. It's a 20-minute video, okay? I swore I wouldn't watch the whole thing. So did the people with the captions, and we swore we wouldn't watch the whole thing. And I was like, I'm not going to watch, I don't have 20 minutes. I couldn't believe this. It was so magnificent that 11 rooms, sleeps 4 comfortably, dinner for 10, and tons and tons and tons of storage space. 420 square feet. I mean, I don't even know how many square feet this room is, but it's smaller than this room. Okay, imagine that. So that's a basis for a differential in value, isn't it? More stuff and more time with less investment of stuff and time. I mean, don't I want the highest quality life in the least amount of time for the longest period of time? Don't I want the highest quality of time in the least use of resources, and vice versa? I mean, all of those things interoperate. So that gives, and when we look at those things in a given context, now we get a sense of best practices, what we can start, what we can stop, what we can keep. And that starts to lead to value optimization. So really, if we start to move down this road, we start to define value in the direction of evolution. And that's a pretty big thing when you consider that our existing value standard is based on domination, competition, extraction, consumption, and waste. So when I talk about context, I'm really talking about miniature agendas. So let's say a miniature agenda to quality of life could be a New York City apartment, or getting water the most efficient way to Tanzania, or an electric car company. But those contexts, or those mini agendas, are really multiple holons in the holarchy. All the New York City housing, all of the water in all of Africa, and the entire electric car industry. And so when we start to get a sense of that, we start to also get a sense of the complexities of value, and there's more concepts to bring into this so that we can understand this. Life moves through time and space. So we need to measure and assign value to that time and space. Well, what's interesting about that is it starts to bring up concepts of classical physics. A vector is a carrier, a velocity is speed and direction. And isn't that, after all, what we're talking about? How rapidly and in what direction a resource is being used? Is this the highest and best use of the resource? Is this the best resource to move with that speed and direction? It could be a currency. It could be an idea. It could be a technology. It could be any life form. Plus or minus, how fast is it moving, and in which direction is it moving? Now, as it's moving in that direction through time and space, balancing quality and quantity, we have what I'm calling potential and impact. Potential is what's possible. Impact is what's actualized, what's real, what's actually felt. And there's a lot of potentially great ideas that this one, for example, that so far have yet to make their impact felt. When we think about, separately, when we think about holons in the holarchy, there's internal value and external value. Internal value is the value that, let's say my body I take care of my body. I'm taking care of the tissue and the organs and the cells inside of it. And external value is I keep my cells healthy and they make me stronger. We can do that with say, the electric car company. A good electric car company acts as a model and a guide for all other electric car companies, and now can start to help an industry. The United States, here's an example. The United States has 5% of the people in the world, but uses 25% of the energy. Okay? Well, that's giving us all internal value, but at the expense of the external value of the world. Similarly, one of my favorite expressions is the cobbler's children go barefoot. So everybody's getting shoes except his kids. Well, that's an example of external value at the expense of internal value. Another important concept when we think about value that doesn't really exist as clearly in our system today, at least not the way that we operate on it, is system integrity value versus extractable, exchangeable value. So, so we're thinking in terms of, say, an apple tree is system integrity value, and the apples are the extractable value that can then be exchanged. In finance, we might call it capital and income and expenses, or we might call it principal and interest. When we ask how two systems can communicate and exchange with one another, they share a larger system integrity. Again, holons within the holarchy can communicate with each other. Now, that exchange is based on how well they serve that larger system integrity, and now what we have is the basis of multiple value standards per a given context, which means that we have a basis for communities trading between one another. Now, we already have these concepts in the existing economy. We have the basis of foreign exchange relative to GNP or interest rates. Let's say the apple and pear orchards both share the need for the same soil, clean water, and clean air. So it's always different systems within the context of a larger system. So now we have a reasonable basis for differential value, system integrity, and value exchange in the system. Now I would dare say that those are key pieces for all of the things that we need to start building our economy. So I'd like to talk about a transition and how some of these tools will actually work. Because really we're talking about, we got some clumsy tools. We've got the dollar, we've got capital, we've got interest rates, we've got principal and interest and so forth. Old ideas of incomes and expenses, all based on the old value standard. But we're going to start bringing in new tools into this. And with those new tools, we're going to create new relational money products and new relational money concepts. And what I like about this is for people like Hollis, who's creating an alternative currency, we can start to create two different value underliers, both the new value underlier and the old value underlier. And we start to give alternative currency organizations an option that they never had before, which was now it doesn't have to be all one or the other. We can have a new value standard, say 10% moving to 20, 30, or 40%. So we'll pay this community currency in 90% US dollars and 10% community standards based on cleaning up the local lake, for example. So now we have a basis of transition. And I would say the full transition comes when we're using 100% of value based on system integrity and extractable value of that system integrity. We have a subject and an agenda. That forms the basis of relational measurement. Basis of relational measurement. Anything that we want to value relative to any aspect of quality of life. All aspects of quality of life taking into account quality and quantity of life, space and time of life, impact and potential of life, values equaling value in life, all of these aspects. And starting to use these concepts in developing currency. Currency, price money, is just a relationship of values. Time is relative rate of change. So now we can start to create a currency, a basis of exchange that operates on relative differentials of what Buckminster Fuller called synergetic advantage. How much more stuff can we do with this design than that design in how much less time? Okay, so we have a basis of exchange, a value differential, which is, well, we can do more stuff with less effort, or more stuff in less time. We have that starts to allow us to exchange goods, services, and currency. We have this value underlier that's actually tied to quality of life. That's something that we don't have right now. And it uses all of those elements. It's really kind of an input-output equation. How much output are we getting for how little input? We have markets of true value, and we can start to optimize goods and services and systems and currency through political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental value and perspective. We have new forms of currency that support one another. We have our apple tree. I get an apple from it, I eat it, I'm healthy, so does everybody else, and now we can tend the apple orchard. So system integrity and extractable, exchangeable value start to work together. This really can be taken all the way into Greg's world, which is financial instruments and indexes, because all financial instruments, whether it be a currency or a stock or a mutual fund or anything like that, it has a baseline and a variable. Here's the first number, then over time or over some other type of change, we get some variance or some variable. So that could be quality and quantity. I mean, think of a stock. Quality and quantity, time and space, potential and impact, internal and external value, input, output, how much value it's moving in this direction or that. So, and when we talk about value, the banks make markets now. The bank says, well, we're going to make the market. We've got all the money. Why doesn't the community make the market? Why don't we take control of that? We all have all the value at our fingertips anyway. And so, so now we've got a tool for finance, and we've got a tool for a balance sheet. We can start expanding the definition of assets, liability, and equity. Assets is all the stuff. Equity is the claim on the stuff. And the liabilities are keeping us from getting at the stuff. We can start to optimize best practices and what Buckminster Fuller called synergetic accounting to get more with less. We can start to eliminate liabilities. When we start to eliminate liabilities, all we're left with is assets and equity. And as we start to expand what we're calling assets, rainforests, and what we're expanding what we're calling equity, not just shareholders but stakeholders, we'll eventually get to a point where all the people are sharing all the world. Imagine that. So, I'd love for you to ask some questions about how this is working, but we'll just talk a little bit about what are the nuts and bolts of Ursula, why this can work. First of all, it sounds like this giant complex thing. So much to think about here. But the truth of the matter is that this is not so much something that needs to be put into effect, but it's something that needs to be realized. That we already have a lot of this built. A lot of the value is already resting in ourselves, and things that we're doing today, and things that we could be doing better if we knew what to do. So, Ursula's made up of, well, we start with collaborative tools. We have an engineering and problem-solving design. We know that people trust a good, transparent process and will be willing to go along with the results if it's fair. And that's principle-based. And I believe that we've got highest quality of life as a guiding principle, and that's just all life. So that's not just the participant, it's everybody else. It's not just everybody else, but it's the participants. It's a truth-based process. I mean, when we think about the accountability of all the information, and that we just picked from a list of 10 instead of a list of 30, instead of a list of 300 items to measure, how do we even know that that information coming in is even correct? Truth. What are truth? Well, truth is supported by facts. What are facts? Facts are nothing but verified, validated assumptions. So we need to be constantly improving our assumptions and constantly improving our validation and verification technology, don't we? And so what we're bringing when we bring networked community evaluations of validated assumptions and validated facts and validated truth, and always dynamically improving it, it becomes very, very difficult for anybody to say, oh, that's not true. Oh, I'm sorry, but we only have all of the best minds working with a collaborative process that is relentlessly truth-based to arrive at this set of conclusions. I mean, okay, bankers, politicians, fools, and thieves will argue with that. But I don't think that the community is going to argue with it, because it is the community, it's all of us that are bringing these truths. Data integrity. So there's a lot of problems with the data on that list of 10 or 300. First of all, how did we get there? It's static. It's based on implicit agendas. It's not commensurable and it's not translatable. So that's probably how those 10 items got chosen in the first place. Oh, well, those were the only carbon and carbon equivalents that we knew of. So that also affects our data selection, whether or not we can translate that data. So then how do we even know, not only if we're measuring the correct things, or enough of the correct things, how do we even know that we're selecting the right data criteria? How do we even know that we have the right selection criteria for that data? We don't. An interesting, dirty little secret of all the environmental measurements out there is that if you start to peel back the layers, you say, Walmart's got a measurement system or evaluation system now. You start to peel back the layers, that's based on a set of databases. Those databases get their information from other databases, and those databases, 90% of it, when I traced it, goes back to a company in Switzerland called EcoInvent, which is where all of this environmental data comes from. Well, please, who's watching that? I mean, is there some data integrity system going on at EcoInvent that's not reductionist and is actually accountable? That in order to do that, you would need the same kind of networked measurement, networked truth-based process, collaborative process that would kill their business model. So there's a lot of this kind of thing going on, and that's just what's happening in the environmental movement. So, so what do we do around these problems with data? Well, we've got a subject agenda setup that's sitting at the basis of all the measurement and valuation. Let's have this subject agenda basis running in the background on the data, making sure that we've got data integrity. So now what we're talking about is highest quality of data for all data in the shortest possible time for the longest period of time. And then any little piece of data that comes up has to run itself through a similar process. So now we know that any measurement we're making always has access to the best data. Not bad. Data reusability. Well, if we, let's say we have oil spill data, and all this oil spill data, core exit, and so on, and it's affecting human health and it's affecting marine life. Some of those things interact, some of them don't. Different contexts. Well, we can just take the same data, instead of starting over again with a new study. This is a huge leap for research and development. That we take the same data and we repurpose it for a new application just by changing the context. This is something that you can do with a relational measurement system that you can't do with a reductionist. So you're really getting a perspective of all the relationships, and the relationships of the relationships, and all the parts and the parts of the parts, in this infinite design that breaks this reductionist mold. Now, who's running this operation? Well, it's not me. I don't know nearly enough as I would need to be even one of the smartest participants in feeding all this information. And it's really a leaderless environment. It's governed by a set of really well-designed business rules, some of which we've just talked about. So that's kind of what you might call a top-down set of principles. And then we have this bottom-up emergent evolution that interacts with it in order to create this thing that we're calling Ursula. Everybody's operating on it. So we're optimizing all of our understanding. We're getting a comprehensive systems analysis because we're looking at all the different perspectives of it. And we're looking up and down the holarchy. Now that's about as complete as you can get. So, so what's interesting about this is that we've now just only talked about all of the importance weightings. Okay, so you've got your data. You have 3,000 things. You put them all in one subject by setting ranges. All the ranges allow you to get a single solitary number relative to any given agenda item. Now the agendas are part of a holarchy, so importance weight those agendas. This is 10% importance of this. These one A and B are, this is 90% and 10%. A is 10% of C. B is 90% of C. C is 40% of X. X is 30% of Y, and so forth.
How do you get those values?
All of this is set by the community in the same way that all of the data is input by the community. And the holarchy of the agenda and the subjects that we're going to measure, all of this is defined by the community. Now we already have a lot of the tools to do this. We do not have to start this from scratch. And now we can start to put those two together and we get Buckminster Fuller's wet dream for humanity, which is a dynamic critical path serving highest quality of life. My take on path of adoption is something along the tipping point model. I used tipping point model in my energy company to go from 0.3% community participation in Palo Alto, which was just begging for a high participation program it was green energy, for the cost of a box of pizza, you can get green energy for your house. It was like that. We were making that whole thing happen. And we went to 20% from 0.3%. And stayed this way, stayed 0.3% for years before we took over the program. Within 2 years, it was at 20%. And when we took over the program, the highest number of participation anywhere in the country was 7%. And we just rocketed past that. And so how do we do that? Tipping point model. We got the mavens first. You get the mavens. The mavens are going to be recognized by the connectors and by the salespeople. Mavens know everything, especially the super mavens that the mavens look at. You get the super mavens, then you'll get the mavens. Mavens know everything. Connectors know everybody. Salespeople know how to tell the story in a compelling way to start to spread to more people. And agent, transmitter, and environment. Message, messenger, and context. So, do we have the right message? Do we have the right messengers? Those are the mavens, connectors, and salespeople. And do we have the right context? Space and time. I think it's the right time. We have to start with the right space. Led Zeppelin looked for audiences in 1968 that thought they would respond to that music. They weren't playing the pop circuit. They would have fallen flat on their face. So we want to look for people who are going to say, oh, hey, yeah, this is a great idea. And there's a lot of talent in this room that knows where to insert a lot of that. So we start to get that adoption path there. We only need 10% of the world to make this tip. We're not going to get 10% of the world on the first gig, but we're going to tip it once, tip it again, tip it again, tip it again.
I think that's it. Erik, you've been amazing. Would everyone agree?
Thank you. Please eat, drink, and I'm available for more questions if you want to get into stuff. Thank you for listening.